September is 1773. A Cossack deserter stands before a gathering of angry, desperate people on the Russian frontier and makes an announcement that will shake the Russian Empire to its core. I am Emperor Peter III, your rightful Tsar, murdered by my treacherous wife Catherine. I survived, and I have returned to reclaim my throne and free you from slavery. Within weeks, thousands of serfs, Cossacks, and peasants rally to his banner. Within months, he commands an army of tens of thousands, controls vast territories, and threatens to march on Moscow itself. His real name is Yemelyan Pugachev, an illiterate Don Cossack with a gift for leadership and a genius for exploiting the rage of Russia's oppressed masses. He's claiming to be Peter III, who had been dead for 11 years, murdered in a palace coup that brought Catherine the Great to power. Everyone knows Peter is dead, but millions of Russians, desperate for liberation from serfdom, choose to believe the impossible, that their murdered emperor has returned to save them. This is the story of the Pugachev Rebellion, the largest peasant uprising in Russian history, a revolution that nearly toppled Catherine the Great and exposed the brutal reality of Russian serfdom. This is about a man who understood that the oppressed would follow anyone promising freedom, even an obvious impostor. This is the pretender who almost became real. Yemelyan Ivanovich Pugachev was born around 1742 in the village of Zimoveyskaya on the Don River, the same Cossack village that had produced the famous rebel Stenka Razin a century earlier. The Don Cossacks were a semi-autonomous warrior community living on Russia's southern frontier, proud, independent, and deeply resentful of increasing government control over their traditional freedoms. Pugachev grew up in the Cossack tradition, riding horses, fighting, drinking, and valuing personal freedom above all else. He was illiterate but intelligent, charismatic, and naturally authoritative. He served in the Russian army during the 7 Years' War and the Russo-Turkish War, proving himself a capable soldier and leader. He fought bravely, received minor promotions, and seemed destined for a respectable, if unremarkable, military career. But Pugachev's life fell apart in the late 1760s. He became seriously ill, possibly with tuberculosis, which left him weakened and unable to perform military duties. He requested discharge from the army with a pension, but his requests were denied or delayed by bureaucratic indifference. His wife died, leaving him alone with 3 young children. He fell into debt, poverty, and desperation. The man who had fought for the empire found himself abandoned by that same empire, cast aside without compensation or recognition. In 1771, Pugachev deserted from the army and became a fugitive, wandering the Russian frontier, working odd jobs and moving between Cossack communities. He was arrested multiple times for desertion and vagrancy, but managed to escape each time. During these wanderings, Pugachev heard the rumors and legends that circulated among Russia's lower classes, stories about the murdered Tsar Peter III. Peter III had ruled Russia for only 6 months in 1762 before being overthrown by his wife Catherine in a palace coup. Peter was widely regarded as incompetent, possibly insane, and dangerously pro-Prussian in his foreign policy. But he had issued some decrees that made him popular with certain groups. He freed the nobility from compulsory state service, and he talked about potentially improving conditions for serfs and religious minorities. When Catherine seized power, Peter was imprisoned and died within days under mysterious circumstances. The official story was natural causes. Everyone knew he had been murdered. Among peasants and serfs, legends grew about Peter III. Stories circulated that he had wanted to free the serfs but had been murdered by the nobility before he could do so. Tales spread that he hadn't actually died, that he had escaped and was living in hiding, waiting for the right moment to return and liberate the people. These legends were persistent across Russia, reflecting the desperate hope of the oppressed for a savior. Pugachev, wandering the frontier, heard these stories and recognized an opportunity. He bore some physical resemblance to descriptions of Peter III, similar age, height, and features. He had military experience, leadership ability, and natural charisma. And he had nothing to lose. If he claimed to be Peter III and led a rebellion, he might die. But he was already living as a fugitive, facing execution for desertion. The risk was acceptable. In 1773, Pugachev arrived in the Yaik River region, now the Ural River, in southeastern Russia, where Yaik Cossacks were already in rebellion against government attempts to reduce their autonomy. The Yaik Cossacks had violently resisted government reforms, killed officials, and were being brutally suppressed. They needed a leader, a figurehead who could unite various rebel factions and provide legitimacy to their resistance. Pugachev approached the Yaik Cossack rebels with his proposal. He would claim to be Emperor Peter III, providing legitimacy to their rebellion. In return, they would provide him with armed support. The Yaik Cossack leaders understood that Pugachev wasn't really Peter III, but they recognized the propaganda value of having an emperor leading their rebellion. They agreed to support his imposture. On September 17, 1773, Pugachev formally announced himself as Emperor Peter III to a gathering of Yaik Cossacks and peasants. His manifesto was simple and powerful. He was Peter III. He had survived assassination attempts by the treacherous nobility. He had returned to liberate the people, and he would abolish serfdom, eliminate taxation, grant land to peasants, and restore Cossack freedoms. Anyone who joined him would be rewarded. Anyone who opposed him would be destroyed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of Cossacks, peasants, serfs, religious minorities, and industrial workers flocked to Pugachev's banner. By early October, he commanded an army of several thousand fighters. By November, his forces numbered over 15,000. By early 1774, his rebel army had grown to nearly 30,000, making it larger than many regular armies of the period. Why did so many people believe, or at least accept, Pugachev's claim to be Peter III? Several factors explain this. First, the real Peter III had been dead for 11 years, and most peasants had never seen him. They had no way to verify what he looked like. Second, Russian peasants and serfs were so desperate for liberation that they wanted to believe. If there was even a chance that Peter III had survived and returned to free them, they would take it. Third, Pugachev was convincing. He carried himself with imperial authority, issued proclamations as an emperor, established a court with nobles and advisors, and generally performed the role of czar effectively. Fourth, and most importantly, Pugachev's promises were exactly what the oppressed wanted to hear. He promised to abolish serfdom, the institution that kept millions of Russians in virtual slavery. He promised to eliminate taxation, military conscription, and the power of landlords. He promised land redistribution, giving peasants ownership of the land they worked. He promised religious freedom to old believers and other persecuted sects. He promised restoration of Cossack autonomy and traditional rights. Every promise targeted a specific grievance of a specific oppressed group. Pugachev's rebellion wasn't just a Cossack uprising. It was a massive, multi-ethnic, multi-class coalition of everyone who had grievances against Catherine's government. Russian peasants and serfs formed the majority. Yaik and Ural Cossacks provided the military corps. Bashkirs and other ethnic minorities who had been oppressed by Russian colonization joined eagerly. Factory workers from Ural mining and metallurgy operations who worked in conditions approaching slavery rebelled and joined Pugachev. Old believers and other religious dissidents joined. Even some minor nobles and merchants, motivated by various grievances or opportunism, allied with the rebellion. The rebellion spread with terrifying speed. Pugachev's forces captured fortress after fortress along the Yaik River. Local garrisons, often sympathetic to the rebels and consisting largely of Cossacks, surrendered without fighting or joined the rebellion. Government officials, landlords, and nobles who fell into rebel hands were executed, often brutally. Pugachev established a court at the captured fortress of Burda, where he played the role of emperor, issuing decrees, holding audiences, and dispensing justice. The violence was extreme. Pugachev ordered the execution of nobles, government officials, military officers, and anyone associated with Catherine's administration. Hundreds were hanged, beheaded, or killed in other brutal ways. Estates were burned. Entire noble families were massacred. The rebellion unleashed years of accumulated rage against the nobility and officialdom who had oppressed the lower classes. This wasn't a disciplined revolution with clear political goals. It was a furious jacquerie, a peasant uprising driven by hatred and desire for revenge. But Pugachev also established rudimentary administration in territories he controlled. He issued manifestos and decrees in the name of Emperor Peter III, distributing land to peasants, abolishing serfdom in rebel-controlled areas, and organizing local government structures. He established a military command structure, appointed generals and officers, organized artillery and cavalry units, and attempted to create a regular army rather than just a mob. By early 1774, Pugachev controlled a vast territory in southeastern Russia. He threatened major cities like Orenburg and Kazan. His army was growing daily as more serfs and peasants heard about the emperor who was freeing them and joined the rebellion. Catherine the Great, facing the largest internal threat her reign would see, ordered the military to crush the rebellion at any cost. In the spring and summer of 1774, the Pugachev rebellion reached its peak. Pugachev's forces laid siege to the city of Orenburg, a major administrative center, for 6 months. The siege tied down government forces and demonstrated that Pugachev could threaten significant cities, not just frontier outposts. His forces ranged across a territory larger than France, raiding, liberating serfs, executing nobles, and spreading revolutionary proclamations. In July 1774, Pugachev achieved his greatest victory, the capture of Kazan, one of Russia's largest and most important cities. Kazan was a major trade center, a symbolic prize that demonstrated Pugachev's rebellion was a genuine threat to Russian state authority. Pugachev's forces stormed the city, overwhelmed the garrison, massacred hundreds of nobles and officials, and burned much of the city. The capture of Kazan sent shockwaves through Russia. If Pugachev could take Kazan, could he march on Moscow? Could he actually topple Catherine? But Pugachev's victory at Kazan was short-lived. Within days, regular Russian army forces under General Mikhelson arrived and counterattacked. Pugachev's rebel army, which excelled at sieges and surprise attacks, proved unable to stand against professional troops in open battle. The rebels were routed, suffering thousands of casualties. Pugachev barely escaped with his life, fleeing across the Volga River with a fraction of his army. The defeat at Kazan marked the beginning of the end for Pugachev's rebellion. Regular Russian army units, freed from fighting the Russo-Turkish War, which had just ended, poured into the region. General Alexander Suvorov, one of Russia's greatest military commanders, took command of operations against Pugachev. The rebels faced professional soldiers with artillery, cavalry, and disciplined infantry. The outcome was inevitable. But even as his military situation deteriorated, Pugachev's propaganda campaign continued. His manifestos, written by literate supporters, circulated throughout Russia. These documents are historically significant as expressions of peasant grievances and revolutionary demands. One manifesto declared, "By this personal decree, with our monarchical and fatherly mercy, we grant to all formerly in serfdom and subject to the landlords to be loyal slaves of our own crown. And we award them the old cross and prayers, heads and beards, liberty and freedom to be forever Cossacks, not requiring recruit levies, poll taxes, or other money taxes." These manifestos promised everything the lower classes wanted: freedom from serfdom, no taxation, no military conscription, land ownership, religious freedom, and the right to live as free Cossacks. The promises were impossible to fulfill and contradictory in many ways, but they resonated deeply with Russia's oppressed masses. Even people who suspected Pugachev wasn't really Peter III often supported him anyway, because his promised reforms were worth fighting for, regardless of his true identity. The rebellion also took on increasingly radical character as it progressed. Initial demands for restoration of Cossack rights evolved into demands for complete abolition of serfdom and noble privilege. What had started as a frontier rebellion transformed into a revolutionary movement threatening Russia's entire social order. This radicalization terrified the nobility and convinced Catherine that Pugachev had to be crushed completely, with no mercy or compromise. As Pugachev retreated south, his army disintegrated. Desertions increased as rebels realized the cause was lost. Government forces pursued relentlessly, defeating rebel detachments, recapturing territories, and executing captured rebels. By September 1774, Pugachev commanded only a few hundred loyal followers, fleeing across the steppes, hunted by thousands of government troops. In September 1774, with government forces closing in and his cause clearly lost, Pugachev faced the same fate that awaits most failed rebels: betrayal by his own followers. His remaining Yike Cossack officers, recognizing that continued resistance meant death, decided to save themselves by turning on Pugachev. On September 14, 1774, they arrested him while he slept, bound him in chains, and delivered him to Russian authorities. The betrayal wasn't surprising. The Yike Cossack leaders, who had originally supported Pugachev's imposture, had always known he wasn't really Peter III. Their support was pragmatic, based on what they could gain from the rebellion. Once the rebellion failed, their pragmatism shifted. Turning Pugachev over to authorities might earn them clemency. Some of Pugachev's betrayers did indeed receive pardons in exchange for capturing him. Pugachev was transported to Moscow in an iron cage mounted on a cart, displayed to crowds along the route. The once mighty emperor, who had commanded armies and threatened cities, was now a chained prisoner, exhibited like a wild animal. Government authorities wanted the public to see that the rebel leader had been captured, that the false Peter was just a Cossack impostor, that the rebellion was finished. In Moscow, Pugachev faced interrogation by government investigators determined to understand how an illiterate Cossack had nearly overthrown the empire. The interrogations revealed Pugachev's intelligence and charisma. Despite being illiterate and facing certain execution, he maintained dignity and even humor during questioning. When asked if he was really Peter III, he reportedly laughed and said, "How could I be the emperor? I don't even know how to read." But Pugachev also showed no remorse for the rebellion or the violence. When confronted with accounts of massacred nobles and burned estates, he essentially argued they had deserved it for oppressing the people. He saw himself as a liberator, even if his methods had been brutal. This lack of repentance convinced Catherine that Pugachev had to be executed as publicly and dramatically as possible to deter future rebels. The trial was a formality. Pugachev was charged with treason, imposture, murder, and rebellion. The verdict was predetermined: death by quartering, one of the most brutal execution methods available. The sentence involved being tied to 4 horses that would pull his body apart, preceded by torture with red-hot pincers and eventual beheading. It was designed to be a slow, agonizing death that would terrorize anyone considering rebellion. However, Catherine secretly ordered that the execution be carried out more humanely than the sentence specified. She feared that an excessively brutal execution might create a martyr and spark new unrest. She also, despite her anger at Pugachev, seemed to have some recognition that he had been driven to rebellion by the injustices of Russian society. So she ordered that Pugachev be beheaded first, making the subsequent quartering merely symbolic rather than an additional torture. On January 21, 1775, Pugachev was executed on Red Square in Moscow before a crowd of thousands. According to witnesses, he maintained his dignity to the end, crossing himself according to Old Believer custom and asking forgiveness from the crowd before his execution. He was beheaded first, then his body was quartered and displayed on wheels at various points around Moscow as a warning to potential rebels. But executing Pugachev didn't end Catherine's concerns about the rebellion. She understood that Pugachev himself wasn't the real problem. The real problem was the conditions that had made millions of Russians willing to follow an obvious impostor. The rebellion had revealed the depth of discontent among Russia's lower classes, the fragility of Russian state authority on the frontiers, and the explosive potential of serfdom. Catherine's government launched a systematic campaign to erase Pugachev's rebellion from memory and prevent future uprisings. The Yaik River, where the rebellion had started, was renamed the Ural River to eliminate the name's association with rebellion. Zimoveyskaya, Pugachev's birthplace, was destroyed and its population relocated. Pugachev's family was arrested. His wife and children were imprisoned, though they were eventually released after some years. Thousands of Pugachev's followers were executed, exiled to Siberia, or punished with knout beatings, branding, and forced labor. The repression was massive and indiscriminate, targeting not just active rebels, but anyone suspected of sympathy with the rebellion. Entire Cossack communities were punished collectively. The message was clear: rebellion against the empire would result in total destruction. But Catherine also recognized, reluctantly, that some reforms were necessary to prevent future rebellions. She established the system of provincial administration that would govern Russia for decades, improving local government efficiency. She attempted to regulate landlord treatment of serfs, though these regulations were largely ignored. She promoted economic development in frontier regions to address some of the grievances that had fueled the rebellion. However, Catherine did not abolish or even significantly reform serfdom, the institution at the heart of Russia's social tensions. In fact, serfdom expanded under Catherine's reign, with more peasants being enserfed and nobles gaining even more power over their serfs. The conditions that had made Pugachev's rebellion possible remained in place, ensuring that Russia would face continued peasant unrest for another century until serfdom was finally abolished in 1861. The Pugachev rebellion had lasting effects on Russian society and culture. It traumatized the Russian nobility, who realized how much their serfs hated them and how vulnerable they were to peasant violence. It convinced Russian emperors and empresses that liberalization was dangerous, that any weakening of autocratic control might spark revolution. This contributed to Russia's increasingly conservative and reactionary policies in the late 18th and 19th centuries. The rebellion also entered Russian cultural memory as a symbol of peasant resistance and the dangers of oppression. Russian writers, particularly Alexander Pushkin, explored the rebellion in their works. Pushkin's historical study, The History of Pugachev, and his novel, The Captain's Daughter, examined the rebellion from multiple perspectives, portraying Pugachev as neither simple villain nor hero, but as a complex figure produced by the injustices of Russian society. For the Russian lower classes, Pugachev became a folk hero. Songs, stories, and legends about him circulated orally for generations. He was remembered as the peasant Tsar who had fought for liberation, who had nearly succeeded in overthrowing the oppressors, whose defeat was a tragedy rather than justice. This folk memory of Pugachev would influence later revolutionary movements in Russia. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Pugachev rebellion is the question of belief. How many people actually believed Pugachev was Peter III, and did it even matter? The evidence suggests a complex mix of genuine belief, willful self-deception, and pragmatic acceptance. Some rebels, particularly illiterate peasants and serfs who had never seen the real Peter III, genuinely believed Pugachev was the returned emperor. They wanted to believe because his return meant hope for liberation. They had no way to verify his identity and no reason to question claims that were supported by Cossack leaders and confirmed by Pugachev's own bearing and authority. Other rebels, including many Cossack leaders and more educated supporters, knew or strongly suspected Pugachev was an impostor, but supported him anyway. They recognized that the imposture was useful propaganda, that calling him Emperor Peter III provided legitimacy and attracted followers. They understood that what mattered wasn't whether he was really Peter III, but whether he could lead a successful rebellion. Still others approached it with sophisticated ambiguity. They didn't know if he was Peter III or not, and they didn't particularly care. What mattered was that he promised reforms they wanted and led a rebellion they supported. His true identity was less important than his political program. This range of belief demonstrates something important about political movements. The literal truth of a leader's claims is often less important than the symbolic truth. Pugachev symbolized resistance to oppression, hope for liberation, and peasant empowerment. Whether he was really Peter III was less important than what he represented and what he promised to do. The imposture also raises questions about legitimacy and authority in monarchical systems. Catherine the Great herself had taken power through a coup, imprisoning and possibly murdering her husband. What made her legitimate and Pugachev illegitimate? Official recognition by the nobility and church, essentially. But if Pugachev had won, if he had marched to Moscow and established himself in power, would he have become legitimate? History suggests the answer is yes. Successful rebels become legitimate rulers. Failed rebels become criminals. The difference is outcome, not inherent right. Yemelyan Pugachev was an impostor, a liar who claimed to be a dead emperor he clearly was not. Yet in a deeper sense, he told profound truths about Russian society that Catherine and the nobility desperately wanted to ignore. He told the truth about serfdom, that it was slavery, that it was morally indefensible, that it brutalized millions of human beings for the economic benefit of a small noble class. He told the truth about peasant conditions, that they were intolerable, that people were starving and dying while the nobility lived in luxury, that Russia's social system was built on exploitation and violence. He told the truth about Cossack grievances, that the government was systematically destroying their traditional freedoms, forcing them into the same subjugation that afflicted the rest of Russia's lower classes. He told the truth about ethnic minorities, that Russian colonial expansion was crushing indigenous peoples and imposing alien rule on communities that wanted autonomy. And most fundamentally, he told the truth about political legitimacy, that Catherine's rule was based ultimately on force, not on divine right or popular consent. She ruled because she had the military power to rule. Pugachev demonstrated that if someone could gather enough military power, they could challenge her rule. The fact that he almost succeeded proved that Catherine's authority was less absolute than she claimed. The Pugachev Rebellion was the largest peasant uprising in Russian history before the revolutions of the 20th century. It mobilized hundreds of thousands of people across a territory spanning thousands of miles. It threatened major cities, tied down significant military forces, and forced the Russian government to deploy its best generals and troops. For over a year, the rebellion controlled vast territories and administered them according to Pugachev's revolutionary decrees. But ultimately, the rebellion failed, and failure in history is damning. Pugachev's defeat ensured that serfdom would continue for nearly another century, that Russia's oppressive social system would remain in place, that millions more Russians would suffer under conditions Pugachev had tried to eliminate. His defeat also established a pattern. Peasant rebellions in Russia would be crushed with overwhelming force, their leaders executed, their followers scattered or killed.